Imagine for a moment a quiet evening. The world outside begins to dim and your thoughts start to drift. They don't follow a straight path, but wander like a small boat floating across still waters, searching for something hidden beneath the surface. In such moments, a question often arises. Who are we, really? Why do we think the thoughts we think? Why do we feel the emotions we feel? And most unsettling of all, are the choices we believe to be ours truly our own? There exists a realm within psychology that many call the dark side of the mind, a place where control does not come through chains or threats or visible force. Instead, it comes through something far more subtle. A glance, a word, a carefully planted feeling. These invisible threads can steer our actions, shape our beliefs, and even make us doubt the very core of who we are. But this journey is not meant to frighten. It is meant to illuminate, to look at the shadows, not with fear, but with awareness. For only by seeing how these hidden mechanisms work can we loosen their grip and walk a little more freely through the maze of our own minds. Philosophers have long wrestled with this question of freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote, "Man is condemned to be free," as if freedom is not just a gift, but also a burden, something we cannot escape, yet often surrender. And yet, if freedom is our essence, why do we so easily hand it away? Sometimes for nothing more than a comforting lie or a reassuring voice. Modern psychology offers part of the answer. Our minds were not designed to seek absolute truth. They were shaped to help us survive, to connect, to find safety in the tribe. We long to be seen, to be loved, to belong. These are beautiful needs, but they also leave cracks in the armor, and into those cracks, others may slip. A manipulator does not need to fight us head-on. They need only to whisper at the right moment, to shift a memory, to stir an insecurity, to give or withhold affection, until slowly our sense of self bends toward their will. Perhaps what makes these tricks so dark is not only their effectiveness, but their invisibility. Rarely does a victim of manipulation know they are being manipulated. They believe they are choosing freely, while in truth, each decision has already been prepared, each path carefully narrowed, each emotion deliberately provoked. So what does this mean for us? Does it mean free will is just an illusion, a story we tell ourselves to feel in control? Does it mean that our minds can be rewritten at any moment without us even knowing? Or does it mean that true freedom begins not in escaping these influences, but in recognizing them and daring to question them? Tonight, we begin a journey into the hidden currents of the mind, a journey through the darkest psychology tricks. We will see how they operate not in far-off experiments or abstract theories, but in our relationships, our workplaces, our politics, our history, and even in the quiet conversations we share each day. Each of these tricks is a mirror. They reflect back not just the methods of control, but the vulnerabilities we all carry within us. The longing to belong, the fear of rejection, the desire to be right, the terror of being alone. And as we move slowly through them, we may discover that what feels like darkness is also a kind of light, the light of awareness. So let us begin. Let us step into the first of these shadows, a trick so simple, yet so devastating, that it can make someone doubt not just what they see or hear, but who they are. It begins with a single denial, a quiet voice saying, "That never happened. You're imagining things." This is where the unraveling starts. This is gaslighting. Gaslighting, the fog of doubt. Imagine someone telling you again and again that what you saw never happened, that the words you remember were never spoken, that the feelings you carry are exaggerated, dramatic, unreliable. At first, you resist. You know what you experienced. You trust your senses, your memory, your mind. But slowly, something begins to shift. Doubt creeps in like a thin mist, blurring the edges of your certainty. You begin to ask yourself, am I overreacting? Did I imagine it? Could I be wrong? This is the essence of gaslighting, a psychological weapon designed not to confront your reality directly, but to dissolve it. The term itself comes from a film made in 1944, Gaslight. In it, a husband manipulates his wife by dimming the lights in their home, then denying that anything has changed. Each time she notices the shift, he calmly insists that she is mistaken, unstable, imagining things. Bit by bit, she stops trusting her own perception and starts trusting only him. The light is dimmer, yet he says it is not. She sees the truth, but he supplies the lie. And eventually, the lie becomes her world. Gaslighting works through denial and attack. The denial is subtle. I never said that. You're remembering it wrong. You're being too sensitive. Each time you hear these words, a small crack appears in your confidence. The attack follows. You always exaggerate. You overanalyze everything. You can't take a joke. With every repetition, your ability to trust yourself weakens. Over time, you no longer need the manipulator to silence you. You begin silencing yourself. You stop bringing things up because you already anticipate their dismissal. You stop expressing emotions because you've been told those emotions aren't valid. You begin to live in a fog of doubt, where your inner compass spins endlessly, searching for true north, but never finding it. The result is not just confusion, it is dependence. When you no longer trust your own judgment, you begin to rely on someone else's version of reality. The manipulator becomes the arbiter of truth, the authority you turn to when your own senses betray you. And in that moment, you have surrendered not just trust, but the very foundation of your identity. Philosophically, gaslighting strikes at the heart of what René Descartes once called the ultimate certainty. I think, therefore I am. Descartes believed that even if all else could be doubted, the act of thinking proved one's existence. But gaslighting challenges this. If my thoughts are manipulated, if my memories are questioned, if my emotions are invalidated, then what is left of this I that Descartes found so secure? Am I still the thinker? Or am I merely the echo of someone else's narrative? Psychologically, gaslighting erodes self-confidence in two ways. First, by destabilizing perception, making you doubt your memory, your reasoning, your emotional responses. Second, by isolating you, cutting you off from external sources of affirmation. Friends and family who might support you are painted as unreliable, dangerous, or untrustworthy. The fewer voices you hear, the louder the manipulator's voice becomes, until it is the only one left. So how can one protect against such an invisible fog? One simple but powerful method is documentation. Keeping a private journal of events and conversations gives you a record to return to when your memory is attacked. Another safeguard is perspective. Sharing your experiences with trusted friends, mentors, or even professionals can break the isolation, reminding you that what you see and feel has validity. But perhaps most important is awareness. The moment you recognize the pattern, the spell begins to weaken. When you notice the cycle, denial, attack, dismissal, isolation, you start to reclaim the truth that was slipping away. Have you ever felt reality shift beneath your feet, not because of what you saw, but because of what someone insisted was true? Have you ever wondered, even for a moment, whether your own mind could be trusted? That trembling uncertainty is the hallmark of gaslighting, and it is only the first step into the darker arts of psychological manipulation. Memory manipulation, rewriting the past memory. It feels like the bedrock of who we are. The stories we carry, the moments we recall, they give shape to our identity. They tell us where we've been, and they whisper who we are becoming. Without memory, life would be unanchored. With it, we believe we possess continuity, a self that stretches through time. But what if memory is not a faithful recording? What if it is less a photograph and more a painting, constantly retouched, recolored, even rewritten? Psychologists have shown again and again that memory is not fixed, it is reconstructive. Each time we recall an event, our brains do not replay a tape. They rebuild the scene like a puzzle reassembled from fragments. And in the rebuilding, suggestion can creep in. A detail shifts, a word changes, a moment reshaped ever so slightly. With enough repetition, the altered version becomes more real than the original. One of the most famous demonstrations of this comes from researcher Elizabeth Loftus. In her now classic Lost in the Mall experiment, participants were told stories about their childhood. Stories supplied partly by family, but also including a fabricated memory, being lost in a shopping mall. Over time, many participants came to remember this event vividly. They described the feelings of panic, the clothing they wore, even the strangers who approached them. But the memory was false. It had never happened. And yet, to the participants, it felt as real as any true memory. This phenomenon has consequences far beyond the laboratory. False confessions in criminal cases often arise because memories are suggested, repeated, reinforced until the accused begins to believe them. Eyewitness testimonies, once considered gold in courts, are now recognized as fragile, vulnerable to subtle phrasing by police, lawyers, or even fellow witnesses. The danger lies in this. If memory defines identity, then to alter memory is to alter the self. Philosopher John Locke argued that personal identity is built upon memory, that we are the same person today as yesterday because we remember yesterday. But what happens if yesterday can be rewritten? If I recall things that never were, am I still the same me? Or am I a story stitched together from truths and fictions, all equally convincing to my mind? Psychologically, memory manipulation reveals the reconstructive nature of memory. Our brains fill gaps with guesses, colored by emotion and suggestion. We are storytellers, not archivists. And this makes us beautifully adaptive, but also deeply vulnerable. Manipulators know this. They don't need to erase the past. They only need to plant seeds of doubt or suggestion. Are you sure that's what happened? I remember it differently. Over time, the repeated suggestion reshapes your memory. What once felt solid becomes malleable, like clay warmed in the hand. And with each reshaping, your sense of self subtly shifts as well. So how can we guard against this quiet rewriting? One tool is recording, keeping journals, photographs, voice notes, anchors that preserve details before they can be blurred. Another is to trust your instincts. Often, even when memory is challenged, the body retains a sense of truth. The unease, the emotional weight, the intuition that something matters, even if the details grow hazy. But perhaps the most powerful defense is awareness. To know that memory is not perfect is not to despair, it is to be humble. To recognize that even the stories we hold most dear are shaped not just by fact, but by perception, by retelling, by time. Which of your memories could be different than you believe? Which moments of your past might have been reshaped by suggestion, by repetition, by the fragile artistry of your mind? And if memory is not the unshakable foundation of identity, then what is? Cognitive dissonance, the mind's tug-of-war. There are few things more uncomfortable than holding two opposing truths at once. When belief collides with evidence, when values clash with actions, the mind enters a state of tension, a restless tug-of-war between what we want to be true and what is undeniably real. This tension is known in psychology as cognitive dissonance. It is the mental discomfort that arises when two conflicting ideas occupy the same space in our mind. And rather than endure this discomfort, we often choose to resolve it, not by changing our actions, but by reshaping our beliefs. The mechanism is subtle yet powerful. A manipulator begins by creating a small contradiction, something easy to dismiss. Over time, the contradictions grow larger and the cost of admitting the truth becomes unbearable. To relieve the psychological tension, we bend our reasoning, we justify, we explain away. And in doing so, we chain ourselves even tighter to the very belief that causes us pain. History offers many chilling examples. Perhaps one of the most striking is the cult known as Heaven's Gate. Led by Marshall Applewhite, its members believed that salvation awaited them aboard a spacecraft trailing the Hale-Bopp comet in 1997. When predictions failed, when prophecies crumbled, one might expect followers to abandon the cause. Instead, many doubled down. They convinced themselves that the failures were tests, that their suffering proved their devotion. In the end, dozens surrendered their lives in a mass suicide, convinced that only through death could they ascend. Here lies the paradox. Evidence against a belief does not always destroy it. Sometimes it strengthens it. The greater the sacrifice, the harder it becomes to admit it was in vain. This is cognitive dissonance at work. When confronted with the pain of contradiction, we often choose the story that protects our ego, even if it costs us the truth. An employee discovers corruption in their company, but convinces themselves it is for the greater good. A partner endures cruelty in a relationship, but tells themselves, this is love. The mind will twist itself into knots, if only to avoid the agony of admitting it has been wrong. This touches on the ancient concern with consistency. Aristotle believed that rational beings seek harmony between thought and action, that virtue lies in alignment. Yet cognitive dissonance reveals how fragile this alignment truly is. When forced to choose between preserving integrity and protecting pride, we often sacrifice the former for the latter. And so, the question emerges, is our commitment to truth as strong as our commitment to comfort? From a psychological perspective, cognitive dissonance manifests as a deep, visceral unease. It is not just intellectual, it is bodily. The racing heart, the restless thoughts, the silent whisper insisting something is wrong. This discomfort becomes so unbearable that people will go to extraordinary lengths to resolve it. often at the expense of clarity, reason, or morality. So how can we resist being trapped by this inner tug-of-war? The first step is recognition. When you feel the tension of contradiction, pause. Instead of rushing to justify, allow yourself to examine both sides objectively. Ask, am I clinging to this belief because it is true, or because I'm afraid of being wrong? Distance and perspective can cool the emotional heat, allowing reason to re-enter where discomfort once ruled. Have you ever found yourself defending something you secretly knew was flawed, simply because admitting the truth felt too painful? Have you ever woven justifications not to convince others, but to convince yourself? That is the silent power of cognitive dissonance, the mind's desperate attempt to escape its own contradictions. And it reminds us, sometimes the hardest person to be honest with is ourselves. Framing effect, the art of words. Words are not just carriers of meaning, they are frames, windows through which we see the world. A shift in phrasing, a subtle change in perspective, can alter not only how we understand a situation, but also the choices we make in response to it. This phenomenon is known as the framing effect. It occurs when the same piece of information presented in different ways leads us to different conclusions. The facts do not change, but our minds do. Consider a simple example: a label on a package of food. One version reads 90% fat-free. Another reads contains 10% fat. Both statements describe the exact same reality, and yet countless studies show that consumers overwhelmingly prefer the first. The framing, fat-free rather than contains fat, steers perception, turning one choice into the healthy option and the other into something to avoid. This bias is not limited to advertising. It threads its way through politics, media, even intimate conversations. A politician might describe a military action as liberation rather than invasion. A company might call layoffs streamlining rather than cuts. A partner might describe controlling behavior as just being protective. Each frame softens, redirects, or reshapes how we respond. The danger lies in how effortlessly these frames bypass critical thought. We rarely stop to ask, what are the raw facts? Instead, our emotions respond to the language itself. Positive words invite agreement. Negative ones trigger resistance. And without realizing it, we are not choosing based on reality, but on the lens through which reality has been presented. This leads us to Wittgenstein. He once suggested that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. If words are the tools with which we carve meaning, then whoever shapes the language shapes the boundaries of reality itself. In this sense, the framing effect is not just a trick of psychology. It is a revelation of how fragile perception can be when filtered through language. From a psychological perspective, the framing effect is a form of cognitive bias. Our brains are wired for shortcuts. Faced with complexity, we lean on the tone and structure of language to guide our decisions. Framing exploits this tendency, reducing thoughtful evaluation into reflexive response. And because we experience the result as natural, of course this option feels better, we rarely realize how we have been guided. So how can we resist the art of words? The key is to look past the frame. When confronted with a statement, ask, what are the raw facts beneath this phrasing? Strip away the language and consider the numbers, the evidence, the reality itself. If a decision feels too easy, too obvious, pause. It may be because the words have already done the choosing for you. When has language swayed your judgment? When has the way something was said mattered more than what was actually said? Words are not neutral. They are mirrors that bend, lenses that distort, frames that shape. And as long as words define our choices, we must remember the world we see is not only the world that is, but also the world that has been described to us. Confirmation bias, the echo chamber. The human mind is not a neutral seeker of truth. It is a storyteller, always searching for pieces that fit the tale it already believes. This is the essence of confirmation bias, our natural tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms what we already think, while ignoring or dismissing evidence that challenges it. On the surface, it feels harmless. After all, who doesn't enjoy the satisfaction of being right? Yet confirmation bias does more than comfort us. It narrows us. Like walls closing in, it limits our vision until we see only reflections of our own beliefs echoing back at us. Nowhere is this clearer than in the age of social media. Online, algorithms learn what we like, what we agree with, and then feed us more of the same. If we click on one article that supports our worldview, soon our feed is filled with voices that echo it. Slowly, the digital space becomes an echo chamber, not a marketplace of ideas, but a hall of mirrors where every reflection nods in agreement. And once inside, it is hard to leave. Contradictory evidence feels threatening, even offensive. Other viewpoints are dismissed not on their merits, but simply because they clash with our own. We confuse familiarity with truth, mistaking repetition for reality. In this way, confirmation bias can turn whole communities inward, strengthening division and blinding us to common ground. Philosophically, this struggle is not new. Plato's allegory of the cave describes prisoners who see only shadows on a wall, mistaking them for reality. To seek the light outside the cave is painful, even frightening. Confirmation bias works the same way. The shadows we already know feel safer than the light that could unsettle everything we believe. The pursuit of truth demands courage. The courage to look directly at evidence that could dismantle the stories we've told ourselves. Psychologically, confirmation bias is rooted in our wiring. The brain favors efficiency. Accepting confirming information is easy, comfortable, energy-saving. Processing disconfirming evidence is harder, stressful, and emotionally taxing. We are, in a sense, built to protect our beliefs, even when they no longer protect us. But there are ways to resist the chamber. One is to actively seek disconfirmation. When a belief feels certain, ask yourself, what evidence would prove me wrong? Then go looking for it. Another is to engage diverse voices. Read from multiple sources. Talk to people outside your circle. Expose yourself to perspectives that make you uncomfortable. Over time, this broadens the mental landscape, keeping the walls of the chamber from closing in. What truths have we ignored simply because they threaten the comfort of our beliefs? When have we chosen to protect the story in our mind rather than face the facts outside of it? Confirmation bias reminds us that truth is not just discovered. It must be pursued against the grain of our own instincts. And with this, we close the chapter on the tricks of perception, the subtle ways in which reality is bent, reshaped, and reframed inside our minds. But manipulation does not stop at thought alone. It extends into the realm of feeling, tugging at the strings of the heart bending emotions into instruments of control. Let us now turn from the tricks of cognition to the exploitation of emotion. Love bombing, the rush of adoration. There is a kind of affection so intense, so overwhelming, that it feels like being caught in a tidal wave. At first, it is exhilarating. Compliments flow endlessly, attention never ceases, devotion feels absolute. You are told you are special, unique, unlike anyone else in the world. It feels like love, perhaps even destiny. This is the essence of love bombing, a tactic of manipulation that begins with an explosion of affection only to withdraw it later, leaving the target desperate to reclaim that first intoxicating high. The mechanism is deceptively simple. In the beginning, the manipulator showers their target with attention. Constant messages, lavish gifts, public declarations, promises of forever. The effect is chemical as much as emotional. Each expression of affection triggers a surge of dopamine, the brain's reward chemical. It is the same system activated by gambling or addictive drugs, a cycle of anticipation, reward, and craving. But soon the flood recedes. The texts become less frequent, the tone less warm, the devotion suddenly distant. And here lies the cruelty. The target, once lifted to impassable heights, now crashes into emptiness. The withdrawal feels unbearable. In desperation, they chase the manipulator, doing whatever it takes to win back the affection that once seemed endless. Love bombing is not confined to toxic romances. It is the lifeblood of cults and authoritarian groups. Recruits are enveloped in affection and belonging. Strangers embrace them as family. Every word affirms their worth. But as soon as loyalty is secured, the warmth turns conditional. Affection must be earned, obedience is demanded, and fear of abandonment becomes the chain that binds. Love bombing raises the timeless question, what is the difference between true love and its counterfeit? Plato, in his dialogues, often distinguished between love that seeks truth and beauty and love that is merely desire dressed in illusion. True love nourishes, expands, and sustains. False love intoxicates, but leaves one emptier than before. Love bombing thrives on the illusion. It mimics intimacy, but its goal is not union, only control. Psychologically, the trap lies in the intermittent reinforcement of dopamine. The brain does not simply crave affection, it craves the unpredictability of it. The sudden bursts, the uncertain returns make the affection feel even more addictive. The victim learns to associate the manipulator not just with love, but with the cycle of craving itself. How then can one protect against such a powerful illusion? The first sign is speed. When affection escalates too quickly, when love is declared after days, when promises feel disproportionate to reality, caution is wise. Another defense is to notice the sudden reversal, the shift from overwhelming closeness to calculated distance. True love ebbs and flows naturally, but manipulation is marked by extremes. Love bombing reminds us that not all love is love. Sometimes it is only the mask of power, worn by those who understand how easily the heart can be deceived. Guilt tripping, the weight of blame. There are chains made not of iron, but of words. Chains that do not restrain the body, but weigh upon the heart. One of the most subtle yet powerful of these is guilt tripping, the act of making someone feel responsible for another's pain until compliance feels like the only escape. The mechanism is simple but devastating. The manipulator reframes the situation so that you bear the burden of their unhappiness. A sigh, a disappointed look, a carefully chosen phrase, "After everything I've done for you," or "I guess I just don't matter to you anymore." Each word plants the suggestion that their suffering is your fault, their disappointment your failure. And so, the weight begins to grow. Even if reason whispers that the guilt is misplaced, the emotional pull is strong. Humans are wired to care for others, to feel empathy, to seek harmony in relationships. Guilt tripping exploits this noblest instinct, twisting compassion into a weapon of control. In everyday life, the examples are countless. A parent guilts their child into compliance with reminders of sacrifice. A partner uses guilt to silence disagreement. "If you loved me, you wouldn't question me." Even friends may employ it, making affection feel conditional. "I guess you're too busy for me now." What begins as a bond of care becomes a contract of obligation. The consequences are subtle but profound. Instead of acting from free will, the victim acts from fear of guilt. They comply, not because they agree, but because they cannot bear the thought of being the cause of someone else's suffering. Over time, the pattern erodes authenticity. Relationships become hollow performances where actions are driven less by love and more by the dread of blame. Philosophically, guilt tripping raises questions about moral responsibility. Aristotle distinguished between voluntary and involuntary action, arguing that virtue lies in choosing the good freely, not under compulsion. But when guilt is imposed unfairly, choice becomes corrupted. The act may appear generous, but if it arises from coercion, is it still virtuous? Or is it merely submission disguised as care? Psychologically, guilt tripping works by exploiting the fine line between guilt and shame. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad." The manipulator subtly shifts the weight from action to identity, so that refusing a demand does not just feel like saying no. It feels like being selfish, ungrateful, even cruel. The mind, desperate to avoid this crushing self-image, chooses compliance even at personal cost. How can we defend ourselves against such an invisible burden? One way is through self-questioning. When guilt arises, pause and ask, "Is this truly my responsibility? Did I cause this pain? Or am I being made to carry a weight that is not mine?" Another safeguard is boundaries, remembering that empathy does not require surrender, and that true love does not demand endless sacrifice. Guilt, when genuine, can guide us toward responsibility, reconciliation, even growth. But when wielded as a weapon, it becomes a chain, binding us to duties we never chose. And from guilt, the progression is natural. For if guilt can bend behavior, so too can the deeper fear of helplessness. Manipulation does not end with shame. It can extend into the belief that we cannot act at all. This leads us into one of the most destructive tricks of all, the cultivation of dependence and the slow erosion of freedom itself. Cultivating dependence, the illusion of need control, does not always require chains. Sometimes it is enough to convince someone that they cannot survive without you. This is the art of cultivating dependence, the slow shaping of a relationship so that one person becomes the sole source of validation, comfort, and stability, while every other connection fades into shadow. The process often begins with isolation. A manipulator will subtly undermine other relationships. Your friends don't really understand you. Your family doesn't have your best interest at heart. Slowly, the circle closes. With fewer voices around, the manipulator's voice grows louder until it becomes the only one left. Then comes the reinforcement. The manipulator positions themselves as the provider of everything: approval, affection, guidance, even a sense of identity. Praise flows when obedience is shown, silence or withdrawal when independence appears. Over time, the victim learns that their worth is no longer self-sustained. It is granted, and it can be withdrawn. The examples are stark. In toxic partnerships, one partner becomes the sole arbiter of truth, love, and self-esteem. In cults, leaders demand that followers cut ties with families, abandon old friends, and rely entirely on the group for belonging. Even in workplaces, dependence can be cultivated when a manager discourages outside opportunities, insisting, "No one will value you the way we do here." The consequence is the erosion of independence. Choices no longer feel like choices. They feel like permissions granted. Freedom fades into the illusion of need, where leaving feels impossible, even unthinkable. The victim does not remain because they are bound. They remain because they believe there is nowhere else to go. This dynamic echoes Sartre's exploration of freedom. Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, that even in chains, we retain the responsibility to choose. Yet cultivating dependence attacks this very principle. If freedom is the ability to define oneself, what happens when that definition is outsourced? What is left of choice if the self that chooses has been reshaped to believe it cannot exist alone? From a psychological perspective, dependence of this kind becomes compulsory. The manipulator engineers a pattern where the victim feels both fear of abandonment and relief at acceptance. It mirrors addiction, the anxiety of withdrawal followed by the fleeting calm of reassurance. This cycle ensures that independence feels not liberating, but terrifying. So how can one resist this quiet cage? The answer lies in maintaining external anchors, keeping ties with friends, family, communities, voices beyond the manipulator's reach. Journals, hobbies, even professional support can serve as reminders that identity exists outside the constructed dependency. The more sources of validation one has, the harder it is for any single person to monopolize the self. Dependence, when genuine, can be a tender bond, the reliance we share in moments of care, trust, and vulnerability. But when cultivated as a strategy, it becomes a cage without bars, convincing us that captivity is safety and that freedom is unthinkable. From here, the descent grows even darker. For when dependence deepens into helplessness, the chains no longer need to be forged by another. They are built from within. This leads us to one of the most devastating psychological traps: learned helplessness. Learned helplessness, the resigned mind. There are prisons without walls, places where the door is left unlocked, the exit is clear, and yet no one leaves. Not because they cannot, but because they no longer believe escape is possible. This is the tragedy of learned helplessness, a state where repeated failure and disappointment condition the mind to surrender even when freedom lies within reach. The phenomenon was first observed in the 1960s by psychologist Martin Seligman. In his experiments, dogs were subjected to mild shocks. Some could escape by pressing a lever or jumping a barrier, while others were given no escape at all. Eventually, even when the path to safety was opened, the dogs who had been trapped before did not move. They simply lay down and endured the pain. The body was free, but the mind had given up. this same pattern unfolds in human lives. Consider the case of Patty Hearst, the young heiress kidnapped in 1974 by the Symbionese Liberation Army. After weeks of confinement, intimidation, and abuse, she emerged not as a victim seeking rescue, but as a participant in the group's crimes, even robbing banks alongside her captors. To many, this seemed incomprehensible, but through the lens of learned helplessness, it reflects a survival response. When resistance feels futile, compliance becomes the only way to endure. The consequences are devastating. Victims of abuse may remain in harmful relationships, convinced escape is impossible. Workers trapped in toxic jobs may stop seeking new opportunities, believing no better path exists. Entire communities facing systemic oppression may internalize the belief that nothing can change. The cage is no longer physical. It is built inside the mind. This struggle echoes the tension between hope and despair. Albert Camus, writing about the absurdity of existence, argued that even in the face of meaninglessness, rebellion, the choice to live and act, is the ultimate defiance. Learned helplessness, by contrast, is the quiet surrender of that rebellion. It is the moment when the flame of hope flickers and dies, leaving only resignation. Psychologically, learned helplessness is not weakness but a survival adaptation. The mind conserves energy by ceasing to fight battles it has already lost. In a cruel way, it is efficient, better to endure than to waste strength on escape attempts that seem doomed. But what once preserved survival in hopeless conditions can become destructive when conditions change. When a door is open, yet a prisoner no longer walks through it. So how can one resist this silent resignation? The first step is recognition. Naming the pattern breaks its invisibility. I am not powerless. I am conditioned to feel powerless. The second step is support. Connection with others, friends, mentors, professionals, can provide the perspective and strength that the isolated mind lacks. Finally, small acts of agency, choices, however minor, can rebuild the muscle of hope, reminding us that freedom begins with even the smallest step. When has life convinced you that resistance was useless? When have you stayed in a situation not because you were trapped, but because you no longer believed you could change it? Learned helplessness is not the end of freedom, but it is the end of believing in freedom. And perhaps that is more dangerous than any locked door. Stockholm Syndrome, the bond of captivity. Imagine being held against your will. At first, there is only fear. Fear of harm, fear of death, fear of what each passing moment may bring. But then something unexpected begins to take shape. The lines between enemy and protector blur. Gratitude creeps in where hatred once stood. And before long, you find yourself defending the very person who once terrified you. This paradox is known as Stockholm Syndrome. It describes the strange, unsettling bond that can form between captor and captive, where fear slowly transforms into loyalty, even affection. The name comes from a real event, a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1973. Hostages were held for 6 days, threatened with violence, trapped in fear. Yet, when the ordeal ended, many refused to testify against their captors. Some even raised money for the defense. To outsiders, it seemed unthinkable. But to those who had endured it, the bond had become real. A survival mechanism masquerading as devotion. The mechanism works like this. In captivity, the victim's world narrows. Every gesture of the captor becomes magnified. A crumb of kindness, sparing harm, offering food, speaking gently, is interpreted not just as normal human behavior, but as mercy. The victim clings to these small reprieves, reinterpreting the captor not as a threat, but as a protector. Gratitude replaces terror, attachment replaces resistance. The consequences extend beyond hostage situations. Victims of abusive relationships may defend their abusers, rationalizing harm as love. Soldiers may bond with those who control them, finding safety in submission. Even in workplaces or groups where power is abused, dependence can masquerade as loyalty. In each case, survival instinct rebrands oppression as care. This tension echoes Heidegger's reflection on existence. To be human, he argued, is to live with a constant awareness of mortality. In captivity, this awareness is sharpened to a knife's edge. Survival becomes the highest priority, even above freedom. And so, the question emerges, what is freedom worth if clinging to it risks death? When survival demands surrender, is loyalty still a choice, or merely the shadow of fear? Psychologically, Stockholm Syndrome is not weakness, but adaptation. It is the mind's attempt to reduce unbearable terror by finding connection, however distorted. By reframing the captor as protector, the victim lessens the threat, creating a fragile sense of safety within chaos. In this way, Stockholm Syndrome is less about love and more about survival, dressed in the language of attachment. How can one guard against such a powerful illusion? In truth, defense lies not within captivity, but after escape. Support and perspective are vital. Voices that remind the survivor that kindness from a captor was not love, but strategy. Healing requires disentangling the threads of fear and gratitude, reclaiming the ability to see clearly what was once clouded by necessity. Stockholm Syndrome shows us the fragile line between survival and surrender, between fear and attachment. And it reminds us that even the bonds we form in desperation can feel as real as any bond of love. Fear mongering, the grip of terror. Fear is one of the oldest tools of control. Unlike persuasion or affection, it does not need to convince. It only needs to overwhelm. Fear bypasses reason, silences reflection, and pushes us into instinctive obedience. Those who understand this can wield fear like a weapon, shaping behavior not through truth, but through terror. This is the essence of fear mongering, the deliberate use of fear to manipulate others into submission. The formula is simple. First, create or amplify a threat. Second, offer yourself as the only source of safety. When fear rises, reason falls silent, and in that silence, power grows. History is filled with chilling examples. Consider the Salem witch trials of 1692. A community consumed by fear of the devil turned against itself, accusing neighbor after neighbor of witchcraft. Fear became contagious, spreading faster than reason could contain it. Trials, confessions, and executions followed, not because evidence demanded it, but because fear left no room for doubt. In the grip of terror, even the innocent begged to accuse others, believing it was the only way to survive. The consequences are not limited to history. Politicians may stoke fears of outsiders, criminals, or vague threats lurking in the shadows, offering themselves as guardians. Corporations may play on fear of inadequacy, selling products as shields against rejection. Even in intimate relationships, fear can be used. The threat of abandonment, the fear of anger, the dread of being alone. Wherever fear rules, choice becomes distorted, narrowed to whatever promises safety, no matter how false. Philosophically, Fear has long been seen as a foundation of control. Thomas Hobbes, in his work Leviathan, argued that fear of violence drives humans to surrender freedoms in exchange for security under authority. While Hobbes saw this as the basis for order, fear-mongering distorts it, manufacturing threats to justify power. It raises a deeper question. If our choices are shaped by fear, are they truly choices at all? Or are they simply reactions disguised as decisions? Psychologically, the process is clear. Fear activates the amygdala, the brain's alarm center. Once triggered, it floods the body with stress hormones, preparing for fight, flight, or freeze. In this state, the rational mind is muted. We become more suggestible, more willing to cling to any promise of relief. Manipulators know this. They need not persuade, only frighten, and the brain does the rest. So how can one defend against the grip of fear? The first question to ask is, who benefits from my fear? Fear is often less about the threat itself and more about the power it grants to those who invoke it. By pausing to ask whose interests are served, we create space for reason to re-enter. Another safeguard is grounding in evidence, looking for facts, not just feelings, before surrendering judgment. Fear-mongering shows us how easily the human mind can be steered when safety feels at stake. But fear is not the only emotion that can be exploited. Jealousy, too, can be planted like a seed, driving wedges between people, turning bonds into rivalries, and trust into suspicion. Emotional blackmail, the chain of obligation. There are forms of coercion that leave no bruises, no visible scars, yet they bind just as tightly as iron. This is the power of emotional blackmail. The use of fear, obligation, or guilt to force another into compliance. The method is deceptively straightforward. The manipulator sets a condition. If you loved me, you would do this. Or, if you walk away, I'll never forgive you. The words carry an unspoken threat. Loss of love, loss of approval, perhaps even loss of peace. Faced with the unbearable weight of guilt or fear, the victim complies, not freely, but under invisible duress. At first glance, it might look like love, care, or loyalty. But true love offers choice, while emotional blackmail erases it. Instead of nurturing connection, it transforms relationships into transactions, where affection must be earned by sacrifice and fear of abandonment. The examples are everywhere. A partner may use emotional blackmail to control decisions. If you leave, I'll hurt myself. A parent may pressure a child. After all I've sacrificed, you owe me this. Even friendships can turn toxic. If you don't take my side, I'll know where your loyalties really are. In each case, the relationship becomes less about trust and more about leverage. The consequences are corrosive. The victim feels trapped in a cycle of resentment and fear, unable to refuse without triggering punishment, yet unable to comply without losing authenticity. Over time, emotional blackmail hollows out the self, replacing free will with a constant calculation. What must I do to avoid guilt, to avoid losing them? This strikes at the heart of Kant's vision of freedom. For Kant, true morality arises from duty freely chosen, not coerced. An action has moral worth only if it is willed, not extracted. Emotional blackmail distorts this, turning duty into a weapon. What appears as responsibility is not an act of freedom, but of captivity. The question then becomes, is it truly virtue if it is demanded at the edge of guilt? From a psychological standpoint, emotional blackmail exploits empathy and compassion. Humans are deeply wired to care for others, to respond when someone is in pain. The manipulator weaponizes this instinct, converting kindness into compliance. By threatening withdrawal, punishment, or suffering, they ensure that compassion becomes the very chain that binds. How then can one defend against this silent coercion? The first step is to name it, to recognize when a request is laced with threat. The second is to set boundaries. Refusing to participate in the game of conditional love is difficult, but vital. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, not hostage-taking of the heart. Emotional blackmail reminds us that not all chains are visible. Some are forged from obligation, others from compassion, but all serve the same purpose: to bind the will. And yet, manipulation doesn't end at the personal level. The same tactics that exploit individuals can also shape entire societies. Fear, guilt, and dependency can be scaled into tools of politics, power, and mass control. From these private chains of emotion, let us now step outward into the vast arena of collective manipulation, where whole communities can be bound, not by love or loyalty, but by the machinery of authority and belief. Divide and conquer, the fracture of unity. There is an old strategy of power, older than kings and empires, whispered across centuries in politics, warfare, and even the most intimate workplaces. Divide and conquer. The method is elegant in its simplicity. Unity is strength. Division is weakness. If a group can be split, if suspicion, jealousy, or rivalry can be sown among its members, then it no longer has the power to resist. Instead of fighting the manipulator, they turn against each other. The manipulator need not strike a single blow. The victims dismantle themselves. History is filled with examples. The British Empire, stretching across continents, relied on this tactic to maintain control. By exploiting existing rivalries between ethnic groups, classes, or tribes, colonial rulers ensured that resistance never unified into a single movement. The empire's strength lay not only in its armies, but in its ability to pit neighbor against neighbor, so that no coalition strong enough to overthrow it could form. The same principle appears on smaller scales. In workplaces, a toxic manager may spread rumors, favor one employee over another, or create subtle rivalries. Colleagues who might otherwise cooperate begin to compete, each fearing betrayal or exclusion. The result is a fractured team, easier to control because they are too busy guarding themselves against one another to challenge the authority above them. The consequences are devastating. Trust withers, solidarity collapses. Instead of standing together, people become isolated, fearful, and dependent on the manipulator, who now appears not as the cause of division, but as the only figure holding chaos at bay. This strategy echoes the advice of Machiavelli, who argued that rulers must sometimes foster division to maintain control. For Machiavelli, unity among subjects could be dangerous, while division ensured loyalty through weakness. Yet this raises a deeper question. If unity is the natural foundation of human strength, what does it mean for our freedom when division is constantly engineered? Is discord our choice, or merely the shadow of manipulation? Psychologically, divide and conquer exploits the human instinct for comparison and competition. Our minds are quick to notice differences, to measure status, to guard against threats. By amplifying these instincts through rumors, favoritism, or mistrust, Manipulators tap into primal fears of exclusion and scarcity. Once fear takes root, cooperation becomes harder, and suspicion becomes the default. So how can we resist this ancient tactic? The antidote lies in solidarity. Unity is not simply agreement, but the willingness to see through the fog of division, to recognize that the true conflict is not between us, but between us and the forces that seek to exploit our fractures. Communication, empathy, and mutual trust are the shields that prevent outsiders from turning allies into enemies. Divide and conquer reminds us that strength lies not in numbers alone, but in connection. A fractured group is easy to lead astray. A united one is almost impossible to control. And yet, division is only one strategy of mass manipulation. Beyond it lies something even more insidious: the ability to shape not just alliances, but the very thoughts of individuals, a process so total that it can rewrite loyalty itself. This is the realm of brainwashing. Authority bias, the weight of power. There is a peculiar gravity that authority carries. A uniform, a title, a white coat, even a confident tone of voice. These symbols can bend our judgment, making us obey even when our conscience whispers against it. This pull is known as authority bias, the tendency to place undue trust in figures of authority, often at the expense of our own reason and morality. Perhaps the most famous demonstration comes from the Milgram experiment in the 1960s. Participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person whenever they answered questions incorrectly. Unbeknownst to them, the shocks were fake, and the victim was an actor. But the participants believed it was real, and still, at the urging of the researcher in a lab coat, many continued to deliver shocks, even when the victim cried out in pain, even when silence suggested unconsciousness. What compelled them to obey? It was not cruelty nor hatred, but the simple presence of authority, the calm insistence of the researcher. The experiment requires that you continue, outweighed the screams of another human being. In that moment, the lab coat carried more weight than compassion. The consequences of authority bias stretch far beyond the laboratory. Soldiers may follow unlawful orders because a superior commands it. Employees may comply with unethical practices because management said so. Citizens may support unjust policies, trusting leaders more than their own moral compass. In each case, responsibility is displaced. I was just following orders. The burden of morality is passed upward, while individuals surrender their agency. This echoes the concerns of Michel Foucault, who examined how power shapes not only actions, but perceptions of truth itself. Authority does not simply command obedience, it defines what counts as knowledge, as normal, as acceptable. When authority speaks, we do not merely obey. We often reshape our understanding of reality to align with its words. The question becomes, if power can redefine truth, how can morality survive unscathed? From a psychological standpoint, authority bias is deeply ingrained. From childhood, we are conditioned to respect teachers, parents, leaders. This instinct helps societies function, but it also makes us vulnerable. The brain takes shortcuts. If someone appears credible, we extend trust automatically, bypassing critical thought. Authority becomes a heuristic, a mental shortcut that tells us if they say it, it must be right. How then can we resist the weight of power? The key lies in conscious questioning. When an authority figure issues a command or states a truth, pause to ask, does this align with my own moral judgment? Who benefits from my compliance? True respect for authority does not mean blind obedience. It means weighing authority against the compass of conscience. Authority bias reminds us that power often speaks with confidence, but confidence is not the same as truth. The lab coat, the title, the uniform, they carry weight, but so too does the quiet voice of conscience. And when the two conflict, the harder path is often the truer one. Scapegoating, the lie of blame. When fear rises and tension spreads, societies often search for a simple answer. Someone to hold responsible, someone to sacrifice, someone to bear the burden of collective anxiety. This ancient impulse is known as scapegoating, the act of assigning blame to an individual or group, not because they are truly at fault, but because their punishment offers the illusion of control. The method is as old as civilization. Instead of addressing deep or complex problems, leaders redirect frustration toward a convenient target. By uniting the many against the few, they ease unrest while solidifying their own power. The scapegoat becomes the vessel for anger, fear, and guilt, allowing the rest to believe that the problem has been solved. History offers countless examples. In Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, fear of witches spread like wildfire. Trials and executions followed, not because evidence was clear, but because the community needed an outlet for its anxieties. In reality, no witches were found. Yet the illusion of rooting out evil gave the people a sense of safety. Similarly, politicians throughout history have scapegoated minorities, immigrants, or outsiders, shifting blame away from systemic failures and onto those least able to defend themselves. The consequences are tragic. Scapegoating breeds fear and hatred, dividing communities while distracting from the real issues. It punishes the innocent while allowing corruption, injustice, or incompetence to continue unchecked. Worst of all, it distorts truth itself, replacing honest inquiry with convenient fiction. This recalls Plato's concern with truth and illusion. In the allegory of the cave, shadows were mistaken for reality because they were easier to accept than the difficult light of truth. Scapegoating works the same way. The shadow of a single villain or group is easier to grasp than the complex, often uncomfortable reality of systemic problems. But illusion, however comforting, can never resolve the deeper truth it conceals. Psychologically, scapegoating appeals to our natural desire for simplicity. The human brain is overwhelmed by complexity and uncertainty. When problems seem vast, we instinctively look for a single cause. A scapegoat offers closure, a clear target, a way to restore order. But this simplification is false, a story that soothes the mind while leaving the real problem untouched. How can we defend against this ancient lie? The first step is to ask who benefits. When blame is directed at a single group, pause to consider, does this truly solve the issue, or does it serve the interests of someone else? By questioning the story, we begin to pierce the illusion. Another defense is to seek complexity rather than resist it. To remember that real problems rarely have single causes, and that truth, though harder to face, is stronger than fiction. Scapegoating reminds us that truth is often obscured by the convenience of blame, but it also reveals a deeper danger. When entire societies embrace illusion, manipulation becomes not the exception, but the norm. Social proof exploitation, the crowd's pull, There is a certain comfort in the crowd. When many voices echo the same belief, when countless feet march in the same direction, doubt seems to dissolve. If everyone thinks this way, it must be right. This is the pull of social proof, the tendency to take the actions of others as evidence of what is true, what is safe, what is good. Manipulators understand this instinct well. By creating the illusion of consensus, they can steer individuals without ever issuing a command. Agreement itself becomes the command, silence becomes complicity, and the pull of the crowd becomes irresistible. The bystander effect offers a haunting example. When a person is in danger, alone witnesses are often quick to act. But when the same danger unfolds in front of a crowd, responsibility diffuses. Each waits for another to intervene, and in the stillness, no one does. The tragic case of Kitty Genovese in 1964, murdered while dozens of neighbors reportedly failed to respond, revealed how social proof can paralyze, convincing each individual that inaction is normal. History repeats this pattern in countless ways. In Salem, accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire, fueled not by evidence but by conformity. Each accusation emboldened the next until the community was swept into hysteria. In financial markets, bubbles form when investors buy simply because others are buying. The rising tide feels like proof of value until the bubble bursts, leaving devastation behind. In each case, the crowd's momentum drowns out the individual's caution. The consequences are profound. Social proof can lead entire societies into error as individuals abandon judgment in favor of belonging. What is popular becomes what is true. What is common becomes what is right. And those who hesitate, those who question, often feel the crushing weight of exclusion, as if independence itself were a crime. This raises the timeless tension between the individual and the crowd. Nietzsche warned of the dangers of herd morality, the tendency of individuals to abandon their own values and submit to the dictates of the group. For Nietzsche, true strength lay in resisting this pull, in standing apart even when the crowd marched as one. The question for us becomes, do we have the courage to trust our own eyes, even when thousands around us insist they see something else? From a psychological perspective, social proof is rooted in survival. Throughout evolution, safety was often found in numbers. Following the tribe meant protection, belonging, and security. Our brains are wired to interpret consensus as truth because consensus once meant survival. But in the modern world, this instinct can mislead, guiding us toward conformity even when it harms us. So how can we defend against the crowd's pull? The key lies in cultivating inner authority. When faced with overwhelming consensus, pause and ask, does this align with my own judgment, my own values? A healthy respect for the crowd does not mean surrendering to it. True wisdom lies in balancing the voice of many with the conscience of one. Social proof reveals the strange paradox of humanity. We long to belong, yet our truest strength lies in standing apart. Groupthink, Induction, the silence of dissent. There are times when a loudest sound in a room is not a voice, but silence. A silence that hangs heavy, not because no one has thoughts, but because no one dares to share them. This is the hallmark of groupthink. The subtle pressure for unanimity that stifles disagreement, dulls critical thought, and leads groups to decisions that no single member might have chosen alone. The method is quiet, but powerful. When harmony is prized above truth, when belonging matters more than clarity, dissent becomes dangerous. The unspoken rule emerges: do not question, do not challenge, do not stand apart. And so individuals, each harboring doubts, fall into silence. The group, mistaking silence for agreement, marches confidently toward error. The examples are as ordinary as they are tragic. A company meeting where concerns about a risky project are never voiced for fear of slowing progress or angering a superior. A boardroom where every head nods in agreement, not because all are convinced, but because no one wants to be the lone dissenter. History, too, offers darker echoes, from failed military operations to financial disasters, where the absence of dissent allowed catastrophe to unfold unchecked. The consequences are clear: poor decisions, missed warnings, preventable failures. But beyond the practical, groupthink corrodes something deeper: the courage to think for oneself. It trains individuals to suppress their inner voice until conformity feels natural and independence feels wrong. This tension was explored by John Stuart Mill, who argued that the freedom of thought and discussion is essential to human progress. Without dissent, even truth loses its vitality, becoming dogma rather than discovery. Groupthink is the antithesis of Mill's vision. It silences the minority voice, leaving the group poorer, narrower, less capable of genuine understanding. Psychologically, groupthink reflects a basic human drive: the need to belong. From childhood, we learn that harmony secures safety, while conflict invites exclusion. In groups, this instinct can override rational judgment. Our brains tell us better to be wrong together than right alone. But in truth, progress often requires the courage to stand apart. How then can we resist the silence of dissent? The answer lies in creating space for disagreement. Leaders can invite criticism, reward alternative perspectives, and remind members that questioning is not betrayal, but a form of loyalty to truth. Individuals too can practice the courage of gentle dissent, voicing doubts not to divide, but to refine. Groupthink reminds us that unity without reflection is fragile, an illusion of strength that collapses under pressure. True unity is not silence, but the weaving together of many voices, even those that disagree. Illusion of choice, the hidden path. Few things feel more empowering than choice: to stand before options, to weigh them, to select one's path. This is what freedom feels like. And yet, what if the choices before us were not true freedom, but carefully curated illusions? What if the path we proudly select was always the one someone wanted us to take? The method is subtle. Present multiple options, but quietly shape them so that all led toward the same destination. The individual feels free, while the manipulator remains in control. Consider elections. In many systems, voters may be given only two parties, each backed by the same interests, each ensuring that no matter which wins, power remains concentrated. The ballot suggests freedom, but the outcome is already contained within narrow boundaries. Or consider marketing. A company offers three versions of a product: a low-cost basic model, a premium high-priced model, and a mid-range option. Most customers choose the middle, believing it to be their independent judgment. Yet the mid-range was always designed to be the real seller. The other two exist only to funnel the decision. The buyer walks away feeling satisfied. I chose freely, while their choice was in fact orchestrated. The consequences are profound. The illusion of choice numbs resistance. If we believe we are free, We do not question who set the terms of our freedom. By focusing on which option to pick, we forget to ask the deeper question: why these options and not others? This recalls Jean-Paul Sartre's reflections on freedom. Sartre argued that humans are condemned to freedom, that every moment demands choice, and with it, responsibility. But what if the very field of options is prearranged? Is freedom still real, or is it only a mask concealing predetermined outcomes? True freedom requires not just choosing, but questioning the framework of choice itself. Psychologically, the illusion of choice exploits our cognitive shortcuts. Faced with a set of options, the brain assumes they are complete, rarely asking if there are paths beyond them. This bias makes us efficient decision makers, but also leaves us vulnerable to those who design the menu. We focus on the visible while forgetting the invisible. How can we defend against this quiet manipulation? The key is to look beyond the given options. When choices are presented, pause and ask, who designed these? What alternatives are missing? Whose interests are served by these boundaries? True autonomy begins not with picking, but with questioning whether the options themselves are real. The illusion of choice reminds us that freedom can be staged, like a theater set, convincing, immersive, but bounded by walls unseen. To live freely is not merely to select from the given, but to step outside the frame and ask what lies beyond. Decoy effect, the clever nudge. Sometimes the most powerful influence does not come from the options we choose, but from the ones we never would. This is the essence of the decoy effect, a subtle trick where an unattractive option is introduced, not to be chosen, but to make another choice look irresistible by comparison. The method is elegant. Present two choices, one small, one large. Then add a third, poorly balanced option, overpriced, inconvenient, or clearly inferior. Suddenly, the larger choice looks like a bargain, the smaller one like a loss. We feel clever for choosing the obvious winner, not realizing that the decoy was placed to guide us there all along. Consider the famous example of movie theater popcorn. A small bucket costs $3, a large $7. Most people pick the small, but add a medium size for $6.50, and suddenly the large seems like the better deal. The medium is a decoy. Few buy it, but it makes the large appear rational. The buyer walks away with more popcorn than they intended, believing it was entirely their own decision. The same tactic appears in politics. A weak candidate may be added to the ballot, not to win, but to split votes or make another candidate appear more competent by contrast. In debates, extreme positions are sometimes introduced so that moderate stances seem more reasonable, even if they are no less manipulative. The consequence is simple. Decisions are nudged without our awareness. The decoy shifts our frame of comparison, steering us toward a path we might never have taken if the option stood alone. The choice feels rational, but it is rational only within the boundaries set by the manipulator. This confronts us with a question raised by Immanuel Kant. For Kant, true rationality means acting from principles, not from the sway of appearances. But when comparisons distort our judgment, can we still claim our decision was rational? Or was it only a conditioned reflex dressed in the language of reason? From a psychological perspective, the decoy effect exploits our instinct for relative comparison. We rarely evaluate choices in isolation. We evaluate them in relation to others. A product, a candidate, Even a partner seems more or less appealing depending on what it is placed beside. The brain is not a calculator seeking objective value. It is a comparator, forever measuring one thing against another. How can we resist this clever nudge? The answer lies in isolating the choice. Before deciding, strip away the comparisons. Ask yourself, if this option stood alone, would I still choose it? By evaluating each possibility on its own merits, the influence of the decoy begins to fade. The decoy effect reveals how easily context shapes our perception of value. It reminds us that freedom of choice is fragile and that even the options we ignore may guide us more than we know. Zeigarnik effect, the unfinished pull. There is a peculiar weight carried not by what is complete, but by what remains undone. An unreturned call, an unfinished task, a promise left hanging in the air. These fragments linger in the mind, demanding attention long after they should have faded. This is the power of the Zeigarnik effect. Our tendency to remember and fixate on the unfinished far more than the finished. The method of manipulation is simple. Leave something incomplete. A television show ends on a cliffhanger, and viewers feel compelled to return. A manager hints at a promotion, not confirmed, not denied, but dangled just enough to keep the employee striving. A partner withholds closure in an argument, ensuring the other remains anxious, waiting for resolution. What is unresolved hooks the mind more tightly than what is resolved. This pull is not merely metaphorical. Psychologists have found that incomplete tasks occupy mental space, intruding into thoughts and stealing focus. Our brains, built to seek closure, treat the unfinished as an open loop, a puzzle that must be solved, a circle that must be closed. Manipulators exploit this instinct, keeping others in a state of suspension, tethered by the desire for completion. The consequences are draining. Instead of moving freely, the mind circles endlessly around what is missing. Energy is spent not on living, but on waiting for the next episode, the promised reward, the withheld answer. The person becomes trapped in a cycle of anticipation, their attention bound not by choice, but by design. This recalls Hegel's reflections on desire and fulfillment. For Hegel, the human spirit longs for wholeness, for resolution. But the Zeigarnik effect weaponizes this longing, stretching desire endlessly without ever granting completion. The result is a hunger that feeds itself, never satisfied, always waiting for just one more step. Psychologically, the mechanism is straightforward. Our brains encode unfinished tasks more vividly than completed ones, keeping them active in working memory. This was first observed by Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s, when she noticed waiters remembered unpaid orders more accurately than those already settled. The unfinished clung to the mind, refusing to release its grip. How can one resist this subtle trap? The key is learning to let go of loose ends, consciously closing tasks, writing down unresolved thoughts, or setting boundaries around uncertainty can release the mind from endless rumination. Sometimes, the act of naming the unfinished is enough to quiet its hold. The Zeigarnik effect reminds us that the mind is not just a seeker of truth, but a seeker of completion. And when this need is exploited, we can be held captive by what is left undone. Foot in the door technique. The slow escalation control is rarely taken all at once. More often, it seeps in slowly, step by step, until what once felt unthinkable becomes routine. This is the strategy behind the foot in the door technique, a method of manipulation where compliance begins with a small, harmless request only to escalate gradually into far greater demands. The mechanism is straightforward. First, the manipulator asks for something minor, so small that refusing would feel unreasonable. Once the person agrees, the manipulator leverages this compliance to justify the next, larger request, and then another. With each step, saying yes feels more natural, while saying no feels inconsistent with the choices already made. Classic psychology experiments have demonstrated this effect. In one study, researchers asked homeowners to place a small sticker in their window supporting safe driving. Weeks later, the same homeowners were far more likely to agree to display a large, obtrusive billboard in their front yard with the same message. The initial act of compliance created a self-image of being helpful and cooperative, making refusal of the larger request feel contradictory. The same tactic appears everywhere. A colleague asks for a tiny favor, then slowly builds toward unreasonable demands. A salesperson begins with a free trial, then escalates to costly commitments. Even in relationships, one partner may secure agreement on small compromises until the other finds themselves conceding far more than they ever intended. The path to control is not a leap, but a staircase, climbed one small step at a time. The consequences are subtle but profound. By the time a person recognizes the escalation, they may already feel trapped, unable to retract past agreements without appearing selfish, disloyal, or inconsistent. What began as free choice becomes a chain of commitments, each link forged from the desire to appear consistent, until autonomy is quietly surrendered. This raises a question explored by Immanuel Kant. For Kant, moral worth lies in acting from principles freely chosen, not in being nudged by manipulation. The foot in the door technique undermines this freedom, turning consistency, a noble trait, into a trap. What appears as loyalty to one's word becomes obedience to someone else's agenda. From a psychological perspective, this technique exploits our natural consistency bias. Humans strive to see themselves as coherent, rational beings. Once we take a stand, even a small one, we are far more likely to act in ways that align with it. Manipulators exploit this bias, guiding us step by step toward choices we would never have made if asked directly. How can one guard against this subtle escalation? The key lies in scrutinizing the small requests. Ask yourself, where might this lead? If I say yes now, what doors am I opening? By pausing at the first step, we can prevent the slow creep that leads to loss of autonomy. The foot in the door technique reminds us that surrender rarely feels like surrender. It feels like a series of small, reasonable steps. And only in hindsight do we see how far those steps have carried us from freedom. Endowment effect, the illusion of value. Why is it that once something becomes ours, we find it harder to let go? Why does possession seem to inflate value, as though ownership itself weaves a spell over the mind? This is the quiet power of the endowment effect. The tendency to overvalue what we already own simply because it is ours. The method of manipulation is straightforward. Let someone hold, taste, or temporarily own a thing, and they will cling to it more fiercely than reason might suggest. A free trial of software or streaming lures us in. After days of use, cancellation feels like loss, even if the product adds little to our life. Retailers place items in our hands, knowing that once we imagine them as mine, parting with them feels like giving something up. But this bias stretches far beyond consumer goods. In toxic relationships, the same effect appears. Once bound by shared history or emotional investment, people cling to harmful dynamics, telling themselves, "I can't give this up. I've already given so much." Ownership, whether of objects, bonds, or identities, distorts perception. We see value not as it is, but as our attachment insists it must be. The consequences can be heavy. We hold on to what no longer serves us: clutter, commitments, even people. Letting go feels like losing value, even when what we keep is harmful. In this way, the endowment effect traps us, binding us to the past and blinding us to healthier futures. Philosophically, this recalls David Hume's reflections on value. For Hume, worth is not intrinsic but subjective, shaped by sentiment, perspective, and attachment. The endowment effect magnifies this truth, showing how easily ownership distorts perception. Yet, it raises a deeper question. If value is so fluid, how can we trust our own sense of worth? How do we separate genuine appreciation from the illusion cast by possession? From a psychological perspective, the endowment effect arises from ownership bias. The act of possessing something links it to our identity. To part with it feels like losing a piece of ourselves. Our brains amplify its value, not because of objective worth, but because of the fragile need to defend the boundaries of mine. So how can one guard against this illusion? The key is to step outside possession before clinging to something, a product, a role, a relationship. Pause to ask, would I still value this if it had never been mine? By reframing the perspective, we can strip away the bias and see more clearly what is truly worth keeping. The endowment effect reminds us that attachment is powerful, but not always wise. To live freely is to see value as it is, not as our pride insists it must be. And with this, we near the end of our journey. We have wandered through the darkest corridors of psychology, from gaslighting to guilt, from authority to illusion. Each trick has revealed not only the power of manipulation, but also the vulnerabilities within us that allow it to thrive. We have walked together through a long journey, one that has carried us through the darkest corridors of the human mind, from the subtle fog of gaslighting to the deep surrender of learned helplessness, from the pull of crowds to the whispers of illusion. Each step has revealed not just the cleverness of manipulation, but the vulnerabilities that make us human. Gaslighting showed us how fragile reality becomes when we allow another to tell us what is true. Memory manipulation revealed that even the past can be rewritten, and with it, the self. Cognitive dissonance taught us that the mind will bend in painful knots to avoid contradiction. Framing and confirmation bias reminded us how words and beliefs can confine us, not with walls, but with perception. Then, in the realm of emotions, we saw how love itself can be twisted into a weapon. Through love, bombing, guilt, dependence, and blackmail. We saw how fear, jealousy, and helplessness can chain us as firmly as iron. Stockholm Syndrome showed us that survival can masquerade as loyalty, binding hearts to harm. Beyond the personal, we entered the wider arena, the strategies that sway not just individuals, but entire societies. Divide and conquer, authority bias, scapegoating, groupthink, all reveal the ways unity can be fractured, conscience silenced, and truth obscured in the roar of the crowd. And finally, we saw the subtler tricks of choice and perception, the illusion of freedom in carefully limited options, the decoy that makes us choose what was always intended, the unfinished tasks that cling to the mind, the small requests that grow into chains, the way ownership inflates value. Each showed us that freedom is never as simple as it feels, that even our judgments, our desires, our sense of worth can be nudged, framed, and shaped. Taken together, these tricks form a sobering picture. They remind us that the human mind is not a fortress, but a living landscape, open, malleable, influenced by every word, every gesture, every shadow. And yet, this is not a story of despair. It is instead a story of awakening. For to see the mechanisms is to weaken them. To know how manipulation works is to shine light into its hidden places. And awareness, once born, cannot be easily silenced. Philosophers have long reminded us that freedom is not given, but chosen. Sartre spoke of the burden of freedom, Nietzsche of the courage to stand apart from the crowd, Kant of the dignity of acting from principle rather than compulsion. Each voice echoes the same truth. Freedom is not the absence of influence, but the strength to see influence clearly and to choose in spite of it. Psychology too offers hope. The same mind that can be deceived can also be trained to notice patterns, to step back, to seek perspective. The same empathy that can be weaponized through guilt can also connect us to supportive voices. The same longing for unity that fuels groupthink can also inspire genuine solidarity. The tools of manipulation are also the tools of resilience. It is the direction they are turned that matters most. So perhaps the lesson is this: we cannot escape the currents of influence, but we can learn to swim within them. We can learn to question the frames, to challenge the crowd, to pause before the nudge, to recognize when fear or guilt is being used as a leash. In this awareness, choice becomes real again. Not perfect, not absolute, but authentic. Take a moment with that thought, and if you feel moved, share it in your reflections, in conversation, even in the comments below. For each story shared is another light in the darkness, another reminder that we are not alone in this journey. And if this exploration has spoken to you, consider joining this path further. Subscribe not simply for more stories, but for more opportunities to walk together into the questions that shape us. Freedom, awareness, the hidden forces of the mind. For in the end, the shadows are not here to terrify us. They are here to reveal the light. The darker the trick, the brighter the truth it uncovers. And in seeing the shadows clearly, we take back what has always been ours. The power to live with clarity, with intention, with freedom. So let us carry this with us, not as fear, but as strength. Not as despair, but as awareness. Because in the end, these darkest tricks are not chains meant to bind us. They are mirrors, showing us the fragile, powerful, resilient nature of the human mind. And as we fade out of this exploration, may you walk with a little more clarity, a little more courage, and a little more freedom than before.